In the mesopelagic zone, we also have this layer of water that's formed that's called the oxygen minimum layer. And it's called that because it's got basically no oxygen in it. And the reason for that is it's at this point in the water where there's still quite a few animals that can survive, and there's still a lot of like detritus and stuff, so there's a lot of respiration that's occurring from the animals and a lot of decay that's happening because of the detritus. And both of those processes, respiration and decay, both require oxygen. So the bacteria that are doing decomposition are taking oxygen out of the water, and the creatures that are eating and doing respiration are also taking oxygen out of the water. And it kind of all comes to a head around 1,600 feet into this layer of water that we call the oxygen minimum layer. It has almost no oxygen in it. And you would think that there can't really be a lot of creatures that live here because there's no oxygen, but that's actually not true. There are creatures that can live here. They do have adaptations that will allow them to survive here, and some of those adaptations will be they'll have extra large gills, and they'll also have hemoglobin, okay, that will function very well under low oxygen levels, meaning it attracts oxygen very strongly. And the extra large gills are to be able to get as much oxygen as possible out of the water because there's so little left. And then below the oxygen minimum layer, there's actually less food, so there's less cellular respiration because there's fewer animals, and less decomposition. So their oxygen is not used up as fast in that layer, so it actually keeps most of the oxygen that it had when it left the surface. So underneath the oxygen minimum layer, there's actually higher amounts of oxygen in the water than above, which doesn't seem logical, but that's actually just the way it is. So here's a picture to help you see this. So in the surface region, the epipelagic, you've got lots of respiration and decomposition occurring because there's lots of organic matter in animals, but you have ways for oxygen to get in the water, so through photosynthesis and then also gas exchange with the surface, so that replenishes the oxygen. Around 1,600 feet, okay, no more photosynthesis is occurring, no more gas exchange with the surface, so you have no ways for oxygen to get in the water, but you still have respiration and decomposition occurring at a high rate. So, it uses up all of the oxygen, and you get the oxygen minimum layer. Below that, there's less food, so there's less respiration and less decomposition occurring, so most of the oxygen that was there in the surface waters remains there in the deeper water. It's called the oxygen minimum layer. Okay, so everything that we just talked to up to until this point was the mesopelagic zone. The deep sea is below 1,000 meters and extends all the way down to the sea floor. Okay, this is the largest habitat on Earth, and it actually contains about 75% of the Earth's liquid water. It's in the deep sea. Pretty crazy to think about. So this place is not an easy place to live. It's very cold down there, about 35 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 degrees Celsius. It's a lot of pressure because there's a lot of water sitting on top of you. There's no light unless it's created by living animals. There's no light from the sun. And there's very, very little food. So only about 3 to 5% of the food that's in the epipelagic zone ever makes it to the deep sea. So these creatures have to deal with these extreme environments. And the way that they deal with the cold temperature is they just kind of embrace it. So they are ectothermic animals, meaning their body temperature is reliant on the outside water temperature, and so their body temperature is about 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And what that does is it doesn't allow them to use energy to try and like keep their bodies warm. They don't have to do that. And when their bodies are that cold, it actually takes the metabolic rate, or how fast the cells use energy, and slows it way down, which means that they are not using up energy as fast. So, which is good because there's not a lot of food for them anyways. So it helps to lower their metabolic rate. However, at these temperatures, you would actually start to freeze because it's very close to freezing. So the creatures that live here, in order to be able to not freeze and survive, they actually have antifreeze in their blood. There's chemicals in their blood that they use to keep from freezing. It's constantly dark down there, so there's no need for counter shading whatsoever. Most animals that live there are gray or black or off-white or like red or something like that. But there's no need for countershading because there's no sunlight to countershade against. And the creatures that live down here, they will have bioluminescence, except for it's much less common than in the mesopelagic zone. And if they do have bioluminescence, it's probably used for attracting prey or for communication, but it's much less common. And then if the fish or animal has bioluminescence, then it will be able to see, but its eyes will be small. But if the animal or fish does not use bioluminescence to communicate or find a mate, then they are typically blind, or they'll just have really, really small eyes and not really be able to see very well, because they are relying on other senses. There's no light to see from the sun to see down there anyways, and they're not using bioluminescence to communicate, so why have eyes? They'll just have other adaptations to be able to find their food and their mates. So, lack of food, not a lot of food. Deep sea animals may not have to adapt to a lot of changing conditions like temperature and light levels and stuff like that, but they do have to deal with this lack of food. So 3 to 5% of the food in the epipelagic zone ever makes it down to the deep sea, and they're too far down there to make vertical migrations because the surface is very far away and the pressure changes are huge. So they can't migrate to the surface to get food. So they have to rely on eating whatever is swimming by or whatever falls from the surface. So that means that there's actually not a whole lot of creatures that live in the deep sea because there's not a lot of food to support them. Most common animals or fish that you'll find down here are bristlemouths and anglerfish, and they are relatively small, so they're about 20 inches or less. But that is actually larger than the mesopelagic zone. If you remember, mesopelagic zone had fish that are between 1 and 4 inches. And the reason for this is because of the lifestyle or life cycle that these fish have in these different zones. So in the mesopelagic zone, the fish reproduce earlier in life. So they put more energy into reproduction early in life and therefore stay small. Whereas these deep sea fish will actually have longer lifespans, and so they actually put energy into growth first and then reproduce late in life. So they put energy into growth first and then reproduce later. So they grow bigger and then reproduce later in life. Whereas mesopelagic zone fish will reproduce early and therefore stay small. So this fish shows you an anglerfish. Remember, I talked about this in class, but you can actually tell the difference between a mesopelagic anglerfish or fish and the deep sea fish based on their eyes, right? Because mesopelagic fish will have big giant bug eyes because there's still light left for them to be able to see, whereas the deep sea fish will have small eyes or be blind because there's not any light for them. Okay, so there's a lack of food, and if these creatures are not swimming around trying to find food, then they are sit-and-wait predators, and they need to save energy. And so all of the adaptations that we saw in the non-migrating fish in the mesopelagic zone are even more pronounced in these deep water fish. So they are very sluggish and sedentary. They have very flabby, watery flesh. They do not have scales or defensive structures, very weak skeletons, and no swim bladders. So they're basically just waiting in the water column for a meal to come by. They also will have huge mouths and very expandable stomachs and a broad diet in order to be able to eat whatever comes by. Probably the best example of huge mouths and expandable stomachs are the gulper and swallower eels. Here's a gulper eel and a swallower eel. They live in the deep sea, and you can see just how big this mouth is compared to the size of the fish. So they have huge mouths. Finding a mate is also very difficult in the deep sea because there are so few fish and they're few and far between. So when you're finding a mate, you have to find the same species, okay, and the opposite gender. And in the deep sea where it's dark and cold and you don't have a lot of energy, then that is very difficult. So one of the ways that these fish deal with this is that they are hermaphroditic, meaning that they're both male and female at the same time. So removes one of the factors. So basically all they have to do is find another animal of the same species and they will be able to reproduce because they are both male and female. They will also use different methods to attract mates, so they'll use bioluminescence to attract mates, or they'll use a chemical attraction in the form of pheromones, where the fish will release chemicals into the water that their species can smell. Or in an anglerfish, okay, it's weird, but it's true, they will do what's called male parasitism. So the male is much smaller than the female, and he will follow her pheromone trail to the female, and when he finds her, he will actually bite onto her belly and become a parasite on her for the rest of his life. So even to the point where like her blood starts to circulate through his veins, and he loses basically every system in his body except for his reproductive system. So it's weird, but basically whenever the female anglerfish is ready to reproduce, she's got a guaranteed partner. So it's effective in the deep sea. So here are two pictures for you to see. Here's the female anglerfish here, and then the male anglerfish attached to her. And this is a female anglerfish, and then the male anglerfish attached to her. So there's also a lot of pressure in the deep sea, which is one of the reasons why we don't know a lot about the deep sea, because it's really hard to get down there because there's a lot of pressure. To the point where down in the like the abyssal plain, you can have up to 14,000 pounds per square inch on each inch of your body. So it's like 7 tons. You can have 7 tons pushing down on each square inch of your body. So that's a lot of pressure. And it's hard to bring things up from the depth because of that difference in pressure. So this is just to show you why it's hard, especially for fish, because they have some of them have swim bladders, and that will kill them if you bring them up too deep or too fast. And so most of them in the deep sea do not have swim bladders. And as we actually go down in the water, you actually get fewer and fewer species because there is more and more pressure and less food. So you get fewer and fewer animals. This picture just illustrates that. Alright, so living under pressure. Your enzymes in your cells are capable of doing chemical reactions and speeding them up to the point where life can exist. Chemical reactions would not occur fast enough for you to survive without these enzymes. So they're critical. If you were to take your enzymes and put them in the deep sea, there is so much pressure that they would not be able to function anymore. But you have things that live down here, so how do they live? Number one, they have enzymes that are much more resistant to the pressure that's down there. And then they also have chemicals in their cells that actually stabilize the enzymes, so they prop them up and help them to work. Which, if you had those same chemicals in your cells, you would die. But down in the deep sea, they're helpful to prop up those enzymes and allow them to work, which is fabulous and allows them to live under a lot of pressure.